This is Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky. We are watching two titans of the game, Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura, facing off at the 2014 World Blitz Championship, and Magnus essaying the Scotch defense, the Scotch opening, which is not necessarily the most common at the highest level, eschewing the Rui Lopez and the Italian in favor of a slightly more rare line, and Hikaru responding with a bishop c5 variation, which is one of the most reputable, along with knight f6, and both sides developing their pieces. Magnus developing the bishop out to g5, pinning the knight on f6, and Hikaru looks up in a little bit of consternation, trying to remember his analysis as he fiddles with the pawn, and Hikaru taking the first significant think of the game as he tries to decide how to deal with that bishop on g5, and he decides not to deal with it for the time being as he continues to develop, and he castles kingside. And the big question for Magnus is, which way is he going to castle? He can move his queen up to d2, and he can castle queenside, or he can develop his light squared bishop and castle kingside. And he does develop his queen. He puts it on f3, pressuring Hikaru's knight on e5, and knight d4 is Nakamura's aggressive response, staking a claim in the center and offering a trade of knights. In the event of that trade, Hikaru lands a very powerful bishop on d4, which is going to be threatening in some cases to take the knight on c3. And if the queen recaptures on c3, there are tactics with knight f6 takes e4. Even though the queen on d8 is hanging, the queen on c3 potentially will also hang. So Magnus has that problem to deal with as now he falls behind by 30 seconds. Hikaru has played very confidently in the opening, and Magnus now taking a piece of his own to fidget with as he gives the position a sizable think, and there's the answer. He castles queenside, and once again, Hikaru looks off to the side. Maybe he's still in his analysis. Will he take the knight on c3? That's the big question, and if he does, how is Magnus Carlsen going to recapture, with the queen or with the pawn? If he has to recapture with the pawn, then his entire queenside is going to be significantly damaged, and Hikaru will have attacking chances. And Hikaru very enticed by that possibility. Magnus not even thinking about taking back with a queen because of knight takes e4. And he takes back with a pawn. And now the big threat is e4, e5, winning the knight on f6. Hikaru must deal with that immediately. And he does. He moves the rook out to e8. And Magnus completing his development by bringing his light squared bishop out to c4. Now notice that the pawn on e4 is untouchable. It cannot be captured with the rook because of queen takes e4. And the queen on d8 is going to be captured by white's bishop. So the pawn isn't the problem for white. The problem for white, as Magnus takes a sip of caffeinated Coca-Cola there, giving himself some energy to think about this complicated position. The problem for white is that damaged queenside. He cannot let black's queen get to a3 or the rook to get to the a file. All of that is a very dangerous possibility. But for the time being, white has some very active development, but a big move there by Magnus as he trades his dark squared bishop for the knight on f6, and he essentially forces an endgame where both sides now have very damaged pawn structures. Black has that damage on the king side, and white respectively has the damage structure on the queen side. Hikaru taking active steps to fix his structure as he pushes the pawn up to f5, and he contests Magnus's control of the center. The idea is to undouble his pawns, and in the event of a trade on f5, black gets his light squared bishop out. And in that situation, I think black is the one who can argue that he's slightly better. So Magnus has to tread very carefully here as he falls now to a minute 20 on the clock. He's a full 40 seconds down. And we know how dangerous Hikaru is in his opponent's time pressure. And Magnus says, no, I'm not trading unless it's on my terms. And he drives the bishop up to d5. He is provoking the move c6, which looks very tempting, but then the bishop will drop back to b3, and Hikaru will have problems with his pawn on d6. So I don't think he's automatically going to play c6. Another sip from Magnus. He seems pretty happy with the way that the endgame is going, and a big decision here to be made by Hikaru. And he finally takes on e4. Magnus recaptures with his bishop, and rook e5 by Hikaru, preparing to lift the rook up to the queen side, but also putting the rook on a defended square. The threat was bishop takes h7 check with a discovered attack against that rook. But now that the rook is on a defended square, Hikaru doesn't have to worry about that anymore. And Magnus, for the second time, moves his bishop up to d5, knifing into black's position, a trade on e1, and king f8 by Hikaru to prevent white's rook from infiltrating to e7. The endgame looks pretty balanced to me, but there is still plenty of chess left to be played. This is not a dead draw. This is very far from a dead draw because there's a lot of pawn structure imbalance, with both sides having weaknesses on the respective flanks. c6 now played by Hikaru, driving the bishop away from the center, and will Hikaru play d5? Not just yet. He develops his bishop to f5 and moves it back to g6 in order to reinforce that weak pawn on f7, and Magnus says, I'm not letting you sleep peacefully on g6, h4, and Hikaru immediately responds with h5. The idea for Magnus was to play g4 and then h5 himself. That was not something Hikaru could have allowed. Magnus brings up his king into the center, and Hikaru pushes his rook down to d8, reinforcing the pawn on d6. Bishop c4 by Magnus. Is he preparing to offer a bishop trade? Yes, he is. And now Hikaru is the one who says, I'm fine to trade, but if you want to take on g6, you're going to have to help my pawn structure improve. Bishop takes g6, f takes g6, and black's kingside pawn structure is fully rectified. I don't think Magnus is going to trade. No, he does not. Instead, he pushes the a pawn up to a4, grabbing space on the queen side. And Hikaru does the same with b6. It does look like black has the more comfortable side of this endgame, but the likeliest outcome is definitely still a draw. Both of these players are legendary in the endgame. And Magnus drops the bishop back to e2, thinking better of that bishop trade and deciding to keep the bishops on the board as he pushes the pawn up to a5. What a bold move there. And if Hikaru takes on a5, the idea for white is rook to a4, when white not only recovers the pawn on a5, but then puts tremendous pressure on the a7 and c5 pawn. So I don't think Hikaru is going to capture that pawn on a5. In fact, I'm confident that he won't. So he keeps the tension, rook to f6, offering a trade of rooks, does Hikaru Nakamura. And in the event of that trade, I don't know who benefits for the time being. Magnus trades on b6, and he falls now to 30 seconds on the clock. He's got to make a decision fast, but he basically has to trade because if he moves the rook away from f4, he loses that critical pawn on f2. So he plays bishop f3, and he agrees to a trade of rooks, but once again, for the third time, he does it on his own terms, and he puts pressure on that d5 pawn. And if he can force Hikaru to push that pawn up to d4, and that d4 pawn is going to be a pretty massive liability for black. So a big decision here to be made for Hikaru. He can play rook d6 and keeps the rooks on the board, and he does just that. I think he's influenced by the fact that Magnus, now with 15 seconds on the clock and the more pieces on the board, the more complicated the position. Magnus making a waiting move, dropping the bishop back to g2 and keeping his eyes on the d5 pawn. And Hikaru does have a hard time bringing the king in toward the center. That rook on f4 is an absolute beast. It's keeping black's entire king side at bay, and Hikaru hesitating a couple of times there. Rook to d8, bishop f3, the sides repeating moves. Magnus is obviously fine with the draw. Is Hikaru fine with the draw as well? No, Magnus is not fine with the draw. What a bold decision by the world champion. He brings the rook up to a4, but immediately puts it back on f4, thinking better of his bold decision because Hikaru, he's got all of his pawns well defended by that rook on d6, and now it's Nakamura's turn to play for a win as he pushes b5 and supports the pawn of the rook, and bishop drops back to g2. Magnus harassing black's queenside pawns with his bishop, and now the pawn on d5 is untouchable because of rook d6. What a vicious trap by Hikaru in his opponent's time pressure. Magnus now with 10 seconds on the clock, and hesitation there as he moves the bishop back to f1 for the umpteenth time. Rook a2 by Hikaru attacking c2, and now a bishop trade, and who benefits from this bishop trade? It's hard to tell. Now white is threatening rook f4 up to f5, forking the pawns on d5 and h5. Hikaru has to prevent that, and he does by moving his king up to g6, and now it's Magnus's turn to expand on the king side g4, leading to some frustration by Nakamura, and the rook is it going to move up to g5, checking the king and forcing it back to e6, and now Magnus with a passed pawn on h4. Is he going to push that passed pawn? Not just yet. He plays rook g1, preventing black's rook from traveling to the king side via a1. And now Hikaru, the one who looks a little bit frustrated. White wants to put that rook behind the pawn on h4, and the pawn is going to rumble up the board, up the runway. Rook a3 by Hikaru, pinning the pawn on c3, and Magnus brings the king back to d2. Hikaru desperately generating counterplay on the queen side, fiddling and twirling that pawn. Rook up to g3 by Magnus, offering a rook trade. Who benefits in the event of that rook trade? I think it was white. Now the rook gets behind the pawn, but Hikaru is in time to stop the pawn with his king. He is just in time, tempo for tempo, and now the pawn on h6 is immobilized. And I think the game is very likely to fizzle out into a draw. Rook to a6, winning the pawn on h6. Magnus wins the pawn on b4, and now the sides only have 2 pawns left, and they're about to have 1 pawn left. King to e2, rook e6 check, back and forth go the rooks, rook takes d5, rook takes f2. This is a dead draw, even though black's king is further away from white's pawn than white's king from black's pawn, because black's rook is more than capable of holding that pawn back, and the sides repeating moves, looking at each other and shaking hands. What a amazing battle between these two players. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to click the link in the playlist for more of these videos. Thank you so much for watching.